Welcome to Ask a Naturalist, Nature on Tap, and it's so exciting to see everybody, and we keep just getting incredible questions and a lot of curiosity, and more people signing in to be part of this. So it's very exciting. It's a fabulous way for us to connect our interest with the natural world with people. So it's exciting. I just want to give a shout out to the Harris Center and remind you all to check our events page. We keep adding things daily to that events page on our website. And we're beginning to do in-person programming, so you can kind of get out and maybe go paddling or birding, or if you have kids or grandkids, we have family programs for that as well. And it's really dynamic right now. We just have been adding things as things in the natural world happen, and people's schedules kind of open up on our staff. So please do check that. Before we get going tonight, let's do a little bit of introductions of the Harris Center staff that's here. So maybe we'll start with Brett. If you want to introduce yourself, please.
Hi, everyone. I am the science director at the Harris Center, and at these Ask a Naturalist events, I tend to answer questions about herps, reptiles and amphibians, and occasionally wildflowers and other things as well. And I did want to mention one little tip for folks who might be having internet problems, because a lot of us have country internet. Sometimes if you turn your own video off, it can help with being able to see. You'll still see us, but it can help you with some of the sound, or if you start to cut out. So
great tip. Thanks, Brett. All right, let's hear from Eric.
Hi, everyone. It's great to see so many people. Boy, these are just growing and growing. My name is Eric Masterson. I'm the Lab Protection Coordinator with the Harris Center, and my area of expertise is birds.
Thank you, Eric. And we'll head right over to Jeremy.
Hey, everyone. It's an interesting evening out there. We just got poured on in Dublin, but it feels good to have rain after so long without it. I'm at the Harris Center, and I answer questions about trees sometimes, or sometimes don't answer them very well. And then if there are any questions about swimming, I can answer those as well.
That's good. I like that. All right, and how about Miles?
Hello, everybody. I'm the newest member of the Harris Center staff. I haven't been there but just a couple months, and I'm the office manager. I make things run smoothly. Hopefully this Zoom goes well.
Great. Thanks, Miles. Miles, do you see if any other staff, am I missing anybody? Usually we have Phil. I haven't seen anybody.
Phil told me he couldn't come this time.
Okay, great.
And Jenna, our entomologist, also can't be here today, so we're holding insect questions till next time, I think.
All right, so if you find any other insect questions, send them in for the next time. And we will have our next one. Let's see, let me just double check. Our next one is the 25th of June. So send in your questions, and let's see, what do we have in store for us today? Miles is going to share his screen, and we'll start with the first question. Right up here. Oh, okay. I noticed while kayaking on the Contoocook River what appeared to be a beaver lodge on the bank. I'm used to seeing lodges in beaver ponds. Is there any difference between beavers that build lodges in ponds and the ones that build on the banks? Is there any reason that they would select one or the other? Victor. So this is a really great question, and it isn't that there's a subspecies of beavers that build bank lodges on the banks of rivers or lakes or streams, and then there's your pond beavers that build them in ponds or lakes. It's all the same beaver. And in fact, a beaver can build a bank lodge and also build a kind of freestanding lodge in their lifetime. They can build one or the other. What usually is a good indication is they'll build a bank lodge when they're moving into a new area. So while they're setting up shop, they're going to spend the majority of their time kind of making their dam first, but they need a place to stay while they're building their dam. So it's kind of like they just build right into the bank. They dig out the bank, and they can build it right there, and it doesn't take as much work, and that gives them the time to work on their dam. And once their dam is complete, then a lot of times they'll move out and build it in the water. It's a little bit safer for them to build it as a freestanding structure, because then something has to kind of cross into the water to get it. But beavers sometimes just build on the bank because maybe the water's flowing too fast or it's too deep. So that's another reason that they might build on the bank. And one thing that's really neat to think about is they dig out the bank. They have really good digging claws. And if you can ever see a beaver up close, and we have one at the Harris Center, or you could look online, you'll see they have really good digging claws. So they'll dig it out, and that's their burrow. And then when they pile sticks, and even beavers that build on the bank will pile sticks on top of it, that jumble of sticks is a fortress for them. It helps protect them from predators. If they just had a burrow that was just kind of dirt, it would be easily exposed by predators, especially if it was on a bank. But if they pile a bunch of sticks on top of it and make it a jumble, it makes it harder for the predators to get in without the beavers hearing it. Like, they hear the noise of the sticks being moved and they can escape into the water. No matter where they build their lodge, whether it's in the bank or freestanding in a pond or a lake, the entrances to those lodges are always underwater, and the same with their exits. And again, I just think they're remarkable builders. The inside of the lodge is actually kind of like multi-floored. You kind of go in, and there's a mud room where the beavers can shake off and dry off. And then there's sort of kind of like a rise or an elevation, a staircase up to a sleeping area. And that sleeping area is a dry area that's often lined with grasses and mosses and ferns, kind of like a dry sleeping area. So pretty cool. And that's a really great question. I just love the idea of observing that there's often two types of lodges that people will see. Does anybody from our panel want to add anything to that? Is there new air that enters the lodge? Great question. Yeah, the lodge is not built nice and tight like our houses are, or some of our houses are. There's a lot of ventilation that goes through. And in the wintertime, if you ever can go over towards a lodge, one way you can tell if it's active is the top of the lodge will have a hole where the snow will be melted off. And that's kind of like their chimney. So all the beavers are in the lodge in the winter, kind of keeping warm, and their body heat will melt the top of the lodge off. And it's typically at the very tippity top. And sometimes if you are brave and feeling adventurous and you climb up and you look, you can see ice crystals formed. And that's from the beaver's breath actually coming up through this airy ceiling of theirs and then freezing on those logs. And it's really just a beautiful sight. Another way to tell if it's active in the winter is just if the wood on top, or any time of the year, if the wood on top of the lodge is yellowish or creamy colored, it's generally fresh, and that means that it's active. If it's gray and looks kind of really faded, then it's typically a lodge that's empty. And beavers will come back and kind of reuse a lodge that's already there. They kind of rebuild it if it's there. So sometimes you'll see a lodge that's been added on to many times and kind of renovated many times. Great beaver question. All right, let's see what we got next. We have a lot of great questions this time. Okay, oh, this is so cool. These photos are from northeastern Vermont. Looking at the moss on the base of these trees, number one, what kind of moss is this? And number two, why does the moss grow to that height? The moss is approximately the same height on many different species of trees in the area. Tasman. And the next slide is going to show a broader view. And when I looked at this question, and Jeremy and I talked briefly, Jeremy said he would take this question to start, and maybe other people will pipe in. So Jeremy.
I don't remember volunteering. I said I could help with this question. I don't think it's just moss that we're seeing. It seems to me that's probably a lichen and moss combination on the base of the tree there. Maybe an old man's beard or the Usnea species of lichen, something like that. I don't know, someone else should chime in if they know what kind of moss that is. Maybe the greener stuff is a moss. What I thought was interesting was the height of the tree. Sometimes you see lichens. There was a sort of a Boy Scout woodsman's thing that if you see lichens or moss growing on one side of a tree, that's the north-facing side of the tree because that's the cooler, moister side of the tree during the summer. And I think probably what we're seeing here is if you look around this tree, it looks like it's either got lots of maybe bracken fern or another tall fern that's growing around the trees. And so that would be shading this portion of the stem of the tree during the hot, dry summer months. And that's maybe why we're seeing lichen just sort of 2 feet up on the trunk, because that's the shaded portion of the trunk in this case. I don't know, that's how I interpreted this picture, but we should get some input from some other people, maybe Brett or Eric.
I have no input, but that's a really interesting theory. I like it, of the fern height.
Also, is the fern height, I mean, there's a microclimate. If you have fern height, what is that? Maybe a foot or a foot and a half. It may be creating the right microclimate of moisture to enable that growth. And higher than that, there isn't the microclimate that it needs.
Could be. It's interesting. And if you're in the Pacific Northwest, you can, and actually not just in the Pacific Northwest, but regions of the West and sometimes in the East, you can actually figure out where snow depth is, average snow depth in the winter, because there won't be any lichens or moss on the tree until it gets up to that average snow depth. And then you'll see moss and lichens on the tree above that. I don't really see that in the Northeast as much, but anyway, this is a fascinating picture. I just think it must have something to do with the remnants of whatever vegetation was growing around this tree must have something to do with the height of the lichen and moss combination.
I wish that I knew more about moss, but one thing is on my bedside, which I haven't quite started completely, is a wonderful book by an incredible author, Robin Wall Kimmerer. She wrote Braiding Sweetgrass, but her first book is called Gathering Moss, and it's actually a field guide with beautiful writing kind of interspersed about moss. So maybe people might want to check that out, especially Tasman, who sent in the question. You might be able to identify the moss based on that incredible book. It's just a great combination of field guide information and gorgeous writing. So a plug for that book. Great. Thanks for sending in the moss question. Beautiful picture. Okay, here we go. I'm emailing to ask if you have any advice or resources available to help rid us property of a lot of invasive plants. We have about an acre that was logged before we moved. It's a large slope behind our yard. It's currently filled with sumac, bittersweet, burdock, some new bindweed patches, lots of glossy buckthorn, and other things I can't identify. We've tried to just whack it down several times, but it grows back thicker than ever. It's way too much for us to deal with, and we can't afford to have someone come in and bulldoze / treat it. I'm concerned that the lovely surrounding area will gradually be overtaken. Our neighbor has put much of his land into conservation right next door to this patch. We've already noticed a spread and are struggling to keep it back. The birds alone are spreading it to our flower beds. I'm at a loss of what to do. Thanks for any help you can give and for pointing me in the right direction. So I'm wondering, Brett, if you have a thought on this, or Jeremy, as invasive people that work and maybe Eric too with the birds. Anybody?
Well, I want to say one thing. I think Jeremy probably has the most direct experience with this, but I'm looking at her list of species, and some of those are for sure. Well, I guess I want to just draw a distinction between invasive and non-native plants and non-native invasives, because some of these that she's describing, sumac and burdock, are native plants that I wouldn't necessarily recommend trying to get rid of. But bittersweet and of course buckthorn, I'm not familiar with bindweed. I don't know that plant. But bittersweet and buckthorn for sure are non-native invasives that will readily take over an area and have a pretty negative impact on native plant communities. When they get really well established, it's very difficult to get rid of them. I think that there is If you really get out there and hand pull before they set seed each year, and you just keep at it year after year, you can kind of keep it contained. And maybe even we've had success with one patch. We've gone every summer for 1 or 2 days with a group of interns. Maybe you could gather friends together, and we've pulled every invasive we could find from this patch along the Caddo Trail in Hancock. And we've had some success with keeping it at bay. And now it's really just seedlings that we're pulling each year, really tiny plants. The first year it was a huge effort, and each year it became a little bit less. It's good to pull them before they set seed, so they're not adding to the seed bank. But sometimes, I mean, we also have other properties where the buckthorn has gotten so dense and there's not much you can really do about it. So I don't know, Jeremy probably has some thoughts on that as someone who's been tasked with managing that, or Eric.
I mean, my response to that would be that, you know, she mentions her neighbor doesn't have it. Her neighbor most likely does have it in the seed bank on his or her property. And the reason that that Sarah is dealing with this problem now is because the property was logged, and it's providing the light levels that these invasives need to thrive. And so what I would do is, I mean, the easiest way to do it is to encourage canopy again, to restrict the light level to the floor. And so if there are oaks coming up, or if there are early successionals like birch or poplars coming up, to help them shade out. Until that happens, you're just going to have to keep on cutting those back to allow the early successionals to come through. That would be one way of dealing with it. But if you're intent on keeping it open, then I would defer to what Brett said. It's going to be a combination of manual and chemical, and if you can get the resources to get heavy equipment in, because if the seed bank is there, you're going to be dealing with it, and the seed bank is most likely in your neighbor's property too.
Yeah. I think the key, Eric's right, is the key is canopy above the invasive plants, because where we've had success, it's where we have a forest canopy above an area that has invasives. And when you pull them from that, they're just not growing as quickly. So you can have a better chance of controlling the invasion. In this case, I think I would walk through that. And Brett's right, sumac is a native species, and that's a species that can get above these invasives and help you in this job. So certainly don't cut that out. And if there's any trees coming through, you want to let them, you don't want to whack those down in the process of cutting the invasives. So I would be very selective in which species I cut out when you're trying to control it, because you're really trying to get other things on top of it to reduce the light levels and reduce, by doing that, reduce the growth rates of the invasive. And in terms of your neighbor's conserved land, as long as that canopy is relatively complete, the forest canopy above, the invasives are going to be pretty slow moving into that. The big one to worry about in that case would be the bittersweet climbing on the edge trees and getting up into the canopy there. So making sure you cut those down. And I really like to cut bittersweet not at the ground level, if it's a big vine that you can't pull, but cut it 4 feet up, so it's easy to see it re-sprouting from that 4 feet, and it will sprout much less effectively from higher in the vine than it will from if you cut it down at ground level. So lots of different ideas, but we're all going to be dealing with this invasive problem for the next century or much more than that. I mean, this is going to be a big deal. If you've traveled to Connecticut or Massachusetts or just ridden on the highways, you can just see how ubiquitous invasives have become, and we're in for that battle in this region here.
I see a couple of questions coming over about knotweed, and I've had some experience dealing with knotweed. I've done some research, and I've actually practically applied some of the lessons learned. And what seems to work best with knotweed, because it redirects nutrients in the winter or in the fall into its rhizomes, is if you let it grow in the spring, and then when it reaches full height, mid-June, late June, cut it back, and then it regrows again, and it further depletes its rootstock. And then in the fall, put your application of Roundup on the leaves in the fall, as the the plant physiologically is drawing those toxins into the rhizomes. And that I've gotten mostly, I had a patch of knotweed that I was dealing with, and I'd say I 90% controlled it in one season doing that.
One thing to think about with that Roundup is if you're able to do, you know, a plant by plant treatment rather than just spraying, because Roundup kills everything. So sometimes you might have to resort to just spraying it in a wide area because it's so dense. But you know, you can also, if it's a smaller patch, treat each individual knotweed plant. You know, cut a stem and drip it in, so that you're not inadvertently killing other nearby plants. But that can be really hard and way too labor intensive for a really intense infestation. There was also a question about whether goats would eat any of these things. Does anybody, I've read about goats being used to manage invasives, but I don't know what they'll eat and not eat.
I think they'd eat almost all of that. The question is, that would just maintain it as a field. It wouldn't really let it grow back to a forest.
Mm.
So goats would be great if you wanted to maintain it as a field, but it wouldn't let you grow trees. Another thing to think about in this process is if there really are no trees growing in this mix, maybe doing some planting out there and really protecting the areas around those trees you've planted and let them grow above the invasive plants to develop that canopy that will shade them out over time.
Great. All right, let's move on to the next question, even though there's still some few questions coming in. Leafy scat, McDowell Dam path near the sandpit. It's like a haiku. Leafy scat, McDowell Dam path near the sandpit. And Miles is piping in, why would this animal eat leaves? Well, I spent some time looking at this scat, and I myself have come across scat that looks like this, as I'm sure other people have. This is a canid scat. It's probably coyote. It's hard to know because there's not a size judgment. It's hard to judge the exact size, but this is very canine-like, and you can see it has a leaf in it, and it's good to think if it's coyote or even a fox, these are generalists, so they're omnivores, and they will eat lots and lots of different things. And at this time of the year, when it's spring and things are kind of succulent, kind of fresh greenness coming out, they will occasionally eat leaf and grass and flowers, and it's just part of the mixture of their diet. And so this is definitely a canine that ate something leafy, and that's not unusual. They really are incredible kind of generalist, and their diet kind of changes with the seasons. And after a winter of maybe just scraping by and eating, you know, what rodents they could catch and what old moldy acorns they could find, they're probably just as happy as we are when those first succulent greens come up. In our gardens, they're probably like, oh, I haven't had a green leaf in so long. And so you will see this scat occasionally, this type of scat. And especially as the summer kind of turns into fall, they'll really uptick their fruit and vegetation eating apples and berries and more grasses and edible flowers and things like that. So yeah, they don't digest much of it. That is true, but not to be gross or anything, but when we eat lettuce, we don't digest much of it either. So it might just be a way of cleansing their system, trying to kind of eating it, and a mixture of food. So, you know, it's roughage for them, and every creature needs a little bit of fiber in their diet, and the coyote is no exception, probably. So I like this. I like this picture, but if you're sending a scat picture, if anybody out there is interested in scat identification, it really helps if you can put some scale in the picture, whether it's your car keys, a coin, even your hand, not right next to it, but your hand near it, so that we can get a scale of it. So it's pretty neat. Okay, let's see what else we got. Anybody want to add anything before we go on? Sorry about that. Okay.
Well, you have an oak leaf there, sort of broken down oak leaf that you can use as scale a little bit.
Yeah, that's why I thought it was a coyote and not a fox, because it's a little bit sizable. Oak leaves are probably that look like a pretty big oak leaf compared to the little stuff growing around it. So that's what I used to kind of judge it as a coyote versus a fox. All right, I think this is another scat question. Oh, I just love these. This was found on a trail in Surrey that went under a high tension power line. It's about 10 inches long. I like that. That's a good way to give me size. Sort of looks like it has porcupine quills in it. I love this. This is so cool. It does indeed look like there might be porcupine quills in it. And it's got this tuft of hair right next to it. And that's pretty interesting. I'm not necessarily sure that tuft of hair is scat. It's sort of secondary. If it had passed through the digestive tract, it wouldn't look so nice and fluffy. It would look like the rest of the scat next to it. But if you do look at that scat, it does look like it has some coarse hair, and it looks like it might have some thin quills around it. It's hard for me to know 100% sure. What I want to see is sort of the black tips of the porcupine quill. That would be a key kind of identifier for me. And, you know, again, the shape is looking very canine to me. It's got those segments, but it's a little hard to see. So I've spent a lot of time today pondering this scat, and I'm wondering, you know, is it canine? Is it Fisher? Because Fisher scat can be really twisty and ropey, and a little bit, this back part looks twisty and ropey, and the way that it kind of rolls back on itself like that does make me wonder about Fisher. So I'm not going to say 100% one way or the other exactly what I think it is, or even what I think the contents are. I would have to see this scat in person to really get a good look at it and really look at the contents. And I always like to say, if you really want to know what an animal eats, take a good hard look at what it excretes. That's my little way of reminding myself, really checking it out and looking. But a good advice to anybody interested in scat is never break open the scat. You might see in old movies where, you know, where a tracker might open up the scat and kind of break it up and look. But what we have found out is that sometimes that can release some bacteria into the air that you can breathe in, and it goes in through your nasal passages and ends up in your brain, which is not a good thing, problematic. So the best thing to do is to collect the scat and dry it out at home in some newspaper for a couple of weeks, and then put it in a jar and then bring it on over to the Harris Center. Or you can just put it in a bag and bring it over to the Harris Center. We're closed right now, so you'll have to wait till we reopen.
I have a suggestion.
Sure, yeah, hey.
I found something similar to that was 12 to 14 inches long. And to me, it looked like a cat had vomited a hairball. It didn't have the fluffiness on the end like this does. But thinking it might have been a mountain lion, which is what I do research on, I sent it in for DNA testing, and it was a coyote.
Yeah, very interesting. Thanks, Linda. That was really good information. Just a good thing too to keep in mind, well, Linda's thought maybe it was a hairball, but cats, bobcats and mountain lions, they scrape over their scat. So when they excrete, they'll use their claw and kind of pull a cover over their scat. Canines do the opposite. They stand and radiate. Have you ever watched a dog who's gone to the bathroom and they kind of stand up and they scratch back and it spreads out the scat or the urine? And that's their way of sort of scenting an area. They're like, oh, I was here, scratch, scratch. Here I am, smell me. Whereas cats are kind of covering it. And if you think about it, cats are ambush hunters. You know, they want to be secretive. They're going to be hunting by watching and pouncing. And so covering up their scat kind of is a way of covering up their presence, their odor from being around there. Whereas canines are chasers. They're chasing their prey down, and they're kind of like, I'm here, I'm going to get you. That's kind of one way I remember it. I also wish I could look at that patch of fur a little bit better. That's separate from the scat. Probably made by the same animal or carried by the same animal. Not 100% sure what that is. It looks a little reddish on the tips. Hard to know. Wondering if Brett or Eric or Jeremy or anybody has anything they might want to add to this mystery.
I do. My first, not so much for the scat, but for that other section that you were just talking about. This spring, I was kind of mucking about in a roadside vernal pool, and I saw something that looked just like that, and it had quills near it, and it was the tip of a porcupine's tail. And I found the rest of the porcupine's body. I think it was probably roadkill at my site, but the tail had been separated from the body, and it looked very much like this. So I don't know if that could be what that is, a porcupine tail or part of the porcupine's tail.
Yeah, it definitely could be. And it isn't just the tail that has unbarbed areas or unquilled areas. The underbelly of the porcupine is also unquilled. And it does sort of have that color, the porcupine color. And it's hard to see if that's a quill coming out of it. So Miles, if you could take your pointer and kind of point to those white, kind of further up higher. Yeah, that's hard to see. It's kind of could be porcupine quills around it. And fishers do go after porcupine. They're the #1 predator of the porcupine. And lots of other animals, not lots, but a few other animals will eat porcupine. And lots of animals will eat roadkill porcupine as well. So if there's a porcupine that's been hit by a car, and that's often many roadkill porcupine is what I see a lot on the road, that's scavengeable. They don't need to mess with the porcupine. They can kind of find purchase and entrance into the porcupine. So good point, Brett. I liked how you have some experience of having looked at that. That's cool. Anybody else, Jeremy or Eric?
So Susie, I mean, there's scat there, obviously. Would that be like a kill site that also had a scat site?
Yeah, I mean, it's not unusual for them to defecate. You know, they got to empty out to eat, or as they're eating, they might have to empty out. Yeah, I mean, a kill site, I would expect to see a little bit more. I would have expected to see more quills spread out around it. I would have expected to see a little bit more carnage around it. Yeah, this is intriguing. I wish I could have seen it. So not 100, I can't give any 100% answers tonight on my scat questions. Bad. Sorry about that. All right, let's move on, see what else we got. Oh, okay. Today, a white-tailed deer ran in front of my car. Its tail was flat on its bum to cover up the white spot, and it looked black and brown. Why is that? My only thought was that it was being chased up a trail and zigzagged across the road and ducked under a low hanging branch into the thickest thicket and immediately disappeared. I assume it was alone and had no other deer to warn with its white patch. Ideas or comments? Linda, is this from you, Linda McCracken?
Yes, it is.
Oh, great. Oh, cool.
And I've got a follow-up too, because the week after, I saw another deer cross in front of me, and it was just walking between a walk and a trot, but very relaxed, and its tail was hanging down with gravity. It wasn't up, but it was, you know, sort of in an angle like that, not tight right on the bum.
Wow, yeah, I wonder, Jeremy, Eric, or Brett, have any of you ever seen any of this behavior in deer that you've watched?
You mean white-tailed deer running without flashing their? Yeah, I mean, I think Linda's answered her own question. If there were, unless it had been alarmed, there was. I mean, most of the time, animals are invested in remaining hidden, and so unless there were some threat that it discerned, there was no. There's no reason for it to advertise its presence. That's pretty much how I would look at it. I mean, that's why so many animals invest in camouflage at cost, because they try to remain hidden. And so the opposite of trying to remain hidden is advertising your presence. And so the only time deer do that is when there's a perceived threat. And so I would venture to say there was just a big deer going out about its business that didn't perceive any threat.
Great. That's great. I liked how you explained that, Eric. Anybody, Jeremy or Brett, want to chime in on that? No. No, I have one other thing too. It's good to remember the tail is not just about communication. It's also a little bit about protection. And so if a tail's tucked close up to the bottom, it's very buggy out. And the bugs are going to find kind of entrance. And if you ever watch a deer, sometimes they'll be flicking their tail. They have a short tail, so it's not like a horse that can kind of use its tail to swat away the bugs or the flies. But if it's pressed up close against its body, I mean, it might just be protecting its back end as best as it can from any kind of biting bugs, because that would be an uncomfortable thing. When I've been watching some deer at the edge of a river paddling, it was really buggy. It was up north in Maine. I noticed the tails were often flush against the body. And it made me wonder if that was just a way to kind of seal up their areas. Just a thought, just a theory, I'm wondering. So good.
What do you suppose flashing the white tail, is that to allow other deer to follow deer running through the woods?
I've always heard of it that was like a warning to other deer that were near it. Danger, let's go.
Danger, let's move everyone.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is my understanding as well, is that it's to kind of be a warning. It's a flag.
Yeah.
Warning. So good. Okay, let's see what else we have. I have a weird thing going on. Okay, hold on. Oh my goodness, this is good. What happened to this plant? By Lars. So this is an exciting answer. I don't know who wants to take it. Anybody? Brett? Jeremy? The witch's broom.
I can take it, but so it's a witch's broom. Susie's right. And witch's brooms can be caused by lots and lots of things. So let's think. What's the most common one we see, Susie? Why do we see something that comes around the Yule season and people kiss under it? What's that?
The mistletoe?
Mistletoe. So mistletoe can cause a witch's broom. Bacteria, fungus, parasitic wasps, a whole variety of different things can cause mistletoes to happen in plants, and they can happen in a variety of, not just, witch's brooms to happen in plants. And basically, it's something's affected the apical meristem of this plant somewhere. So
could you explain that, Jeremy? What
that's the top bud, the bud that's growing at the top point of this particular leader in the bush or the tree. And when it does that, it affects the production of cytokinin, which I saw that cytokinin is a hormone that's used in plants, but we've been hearing a lot about cytokine storms in people with COVID-19, but that's a completely different thing. That's a protein that's in mammals and humans, but cytokinin is a hormone in plants that regulates plant growth. And basically that the wasp or the bacteria or the fungal infection in the apical meristem produces a lot of cytokinin, and it overdoes. The opposite of cytokinin is an oxidant. There's another hormone. And so the cytokinin means that the plant growth kind of goes crazy, and you get all of these brushy stems all over the place, and the development of what's called a witch's broom. I gather that people used to think of this as where a witch had rested for a while or landed in a bush, that a flying witch lands here and then they leave this structure left in the woods. Some people call it squirrel nest. I'd never heard that before, but I guess it is used by some creatures for habitat for sure. Anyway, you'll find these, I see them all the time in high bush blueberries, but there's a whole variety of other hardwood species and some conifer species that you'll see witch's broom-like characteristics, but there's a whole variety of different causes to it. It's not just one thing that causes it.
But it's essentially, it's an immune response by the plant itself. So it's not, there's some sort of external force that's eliciting that response, but it itself is not a different species, unlike mistletoe, which is a different parasitic.
Yeah, I wouldn't call it an immune response, because it's actually the the infection, the agent that's causing this, is causing a response that's it's not the plant defending itself. It's the plant is releasing is producing a hormone in much higher amounts than it should be because of the impact of the infestation.
Very interesting.
Jeremy, does it provide any benefit to the plant, the witch's broom?
No. It won't necessarily kill the plant, but if you cut them out, typically they'll come back because the plant's infected with whatever the causal agent is in that case.
Fascinating. I like the mythology of it too. That's pretty neat. I always thought it was witch's broom because it looked like a broom, but yeah, it makes sense that maybe it's called that way because it's where they rested.
Oh no, it looks like a broom, but it's something about them flying in and resting, and then the plant produces something that looks like their broom.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you.
I have a question about those. I've seen this on high bush blueberries in my woods, and I've noticed over the years that it's been kind of deteriorating. It's kind of shrunk up and gotten dark and not as vibrant as it used to be. And so is that a natural progression of it?
I don't really know, but I would guess so. Is the high bush blueberry also sort of looking like it's getting old, or is that doing okay?
Well, they're in the woods, so they don't really produce much. I haven't looked at it recently. I don't think that the bush has been doing much of anything.
Mm-hmm.
I'll have to look at it again.
It's not particularly healthy growth, so it's not as though that growth is producing enough carbohydrate from photosynthesis to keep itself going. So they may well die over time because it's not a healthy portion of the plant.
Great. Thank you. That was a really interesting conversation about witch's broom. Sorry about the dog barking. All right, Eric, this is looking for you. It says, what bird says chirp, 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 always in threes and in rapid succession? I think it's the same.
You said it the wrong way. It's chirp, chirp, chirp.
Oh, perfect. Pat, this is from you. I'm so glad you're here. Can you do it again?
Chirp, chirp, chirp.
Good.
The way the older birds sounded like giddy up, giddy up, giddy up. So it's the same. This one doesn't say muchachos, but it may be because this bird is further into the woods and I don't hear that part.
So Eric, what is this?
Well, so Pat, is this your submission?
Yes.
So, I mean, identification, there's an awful lot of factors coming to the mix to help you spit out a correct identification. Habitat is key. Can you explain a little bit about the habitat, where the sound was coming from?
It's probably from the woods, and it's a mix of hardwoods and softwoods and some open places and some more dense. It's sort of everything.
Okay. And was it wet or dry?
Well, it's also both, but it's probably closer to the house. Or where this might be coming from, might be a little wet, might be.
I mean, the first thing that mnemonics are great for some species like Phoebe or Veery, where they get their name. It's a really good match for we have the birds have a syrinx, we have a larynx, so they're functionally different, and so we really struggle to put words on bird sounds. It really is we're constrained in how we can describe sounds with the English language. That being said, when I saw this, the first thing I thought of was robin, to be quite honest with you. Now, I know you know robin's song, so I'm going to guess it wasn't a robin. But robin do have a cadence to them that would match that quite well. Phil Brown, who's not here, he had made a good point, which is that with distance, you lose some parts of birdsong more than others. You get an attenuation of higher frequency sounds, whereas lower frequency sounds carry. And so if this was a bird that was farther into the forest, you may be losing part of the song and only getting the chirp, chirp, chirp. And so there are birds like common yellowthroat that have songs that are repetitive like this. So one of the things that you've clearly identified here is that this is a repetitive song. And so that's a really good, if you're looking for help to identify, and the key is writing a good description. And so you've conveyed here that it's repetitive. And so that rules out a whole bunch of species. So yellowthroat is a possibility. They have a song that has the frequencies fluctuate, and so that's possible, but it's difficult to be sure. Do you have a yellowthroat here?
Are you asking me?
No, I think Miles has yellowthroat sound.
What? Yeah, I'm familiar with the yellowthroat doing witchetty, 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 and it's not that song.
Right. So, okay, you want to cycle through those, Miles?
Sure.
It's not the teacher.
It's not that either.
But actually the last yellowthroat recording that he played, if he could do that again, that might be more like it.
So you can see how there's different frequencies there. You may have been losing the higher pitched frequencies and just hearing the lower pitch. It's possible. It's hard to be sure. It's like Susie Scat. It's hard to be sure with the information provided, but that would be an option.
Yeah, I found a great page that had, when I printed it out, it was 4 pages long of mnemonics of birds. And when I cycled through them, I couldn't find any, when I clicked to hear the actual bird song, I didn't find any that really fit it. But I know I have seen yellowthroats here in the past. So it is possible that I'm hearing only part of the song. I don't think it's cardinal.
The next slide is a good example of describing habitat. You know, the more factors you can give, the quicker you'll get to an identification. It's unlikely to be a Carolina wren, because Carolina wren are not a forest bird. They're not going to be in the interior of the forest. They're more of a backyard bird. So that rules that out from my perspective. So it's hard to know for sure, but if you think yellowthroat sounded a little bit like it, maybe that's a possibility.
Yeah, I'll keep listening and watching.
Yeah, and you use it if you have a smartphone. If you can grab a snippet, that always helps.
Well, I loaded something called eBird that you're supposed to be able to record the bird and then it will identify it. I haven't been able to do that yet.
Yeah, that technology is not where it needs to be yet. So I think the best thing to do is grab a snippet with your phone and send it to someone who's good on birdsong.
Okay.
The voice memo program, if most phones come with it, and you can just kind of, or a video just for the sound is really quick.
Yeah.
Great suggestions. I think we have another bird question coming up. Let's check this out. Why would 2 female turkeys be sitting on the same nest with lots of eggs? We saw this in our friend's backyard, and this might be one of our furthest away questions. The Browns from Staten Island. Eric, what's up with that? Do they share nests?
So I question whether there was 2 females. So turkeys, I mean, turkeys are first off, the male is pretty, they're if you've ever heard of OR selected versus K selected, it's quantity versus quality. The turkey is an OR selected species, so it has lots of eggs and invests very little in the young. So the male basically fertilizes the female and then is done. It doesn't incubate, it doesn't feed the young, it doesn't do anything like that. And even the female, once the young have hatched, they're what are called nidificous. So there are two types of chicks, nidificous and atricial. Nidificous young are young that are essentially self-sustaining immediately out of the egg. They can run, they can do everything but fly. They feed themselves. And turkeys are nidificous hatchlings. They're pretty much able to look after themselves straight out of the egg. But the female will feed them for a few days, and then they'll start taking care of themselves more progressively. They will also do what's called egg dumping. So ducks will do this too, where you will have several turkeys occasionally, not always. You'll have one or more turkeys, female turkeys will dump eggs in the same nest, and it's a way of spreading your genes with minimal investment, which is a good trick if you want to leave a lot of offspring. So they're an odd species in that respect. I don't see any scenario where you're going to get two, and I never say never in the natural world, because as soon as you say never, something is going to prove you wrong, but it doesn't sound right to me. And also turkeys, outside of the high breeding season, when the males are very distinctive, the old toms are very distinctive with their bluish heads and their dewlap and their beards. Outside of the breeding season, the high breeding season, they're actually not that distinctive. The females and the males can look quite similar. So I question whether there were two females. I suspect that it was a female and maybe a younger male that didn't have quite the coloration that an older tom and high breeding plumage would have. So that's my thinking on that. And if these are the two birds, I certainly wouldn't call those two females based on that picture.
Very interesting. Well, it is from Staten Island. Maybe they do things different. Staten Island birds.
And maybe so. And even female turkeys can occasionally have beards. So they really that keratin protrusion that extends from the tom's neck. So they really can be quite similar.
Fascinating. Things I never knew about female turkeys and
Yeah.
their beards. Let's see what our next question is. Hi, friends. We went for a hike today up North Pack and saw some lady slippers. We've seen them throughout the spring on many of our hikes, but only today we began wondering why some lady slippers are darker pink and some are lighter pink. Any ideas? Thanks. From Hazel, Thea, and Lula. So Brett, I wonder if this is a question you might feel comfortable responding to.
I did a little looking into this based on a paper that Phil Brown sent to me, because I thought he would know, and he and I talked briefly about this. So if there's other folks who want to chime in after I say what I found, I'd be happy to hear from them. I didn't find anything specifically about lady slippers, but I did look at a paper that talked about kind of flowers in general and why different flowers of the same species might have different coloration. And the short answer is it's complicated, and there's lots of possible reasons, going from soil characteristics, pH, stress responses to drought, pollinator, evolutionary response to different pollinators. One thing that I found really interesting is that there was some discussion that it may be a byproduct, that it might not be about the color or about appealing to pollinators, but it might just be that the pigments don't just give the flowers color, they also can have other purposes as well, like protection from UV light. And so it may be a response to local conditions where, it's more beneficial to have darker coloration for better protection from UV light, not so much about the color and appealing to pollinators. So there's it seems like there's quite a lot of complicated factors related to both biotic conditions like interactions with other species, but also abiotic conditions like drought and sunlight. Jeremy might have other things to add here, or Eric, I don't know. That's what my digging found.
Good work, Brett. Thanks for sleuthing that out. That was great. And then what an interesting question and what a great observation. All right, let's see what our next one is. I live in Alstead near Orchard Hill Bakery and a small farm. This year we have noticed these pieces of skin hanging in trees in the woods. My husband, who used to do a lot of farming, thinks they are pig skin. Pigskin. Our neighbors are big hunters and they can't think of any reason this would be done by a person. The skin is probably 5 feet up in the air on a relatively thin branch. There are several of them. This one is the largest, probably 6 inches by 12 inches, if it weren't all dried up and shriveled. Any ideas what might do this? So this question, I've spent a lot of time sending around to different people, checking it out, and I spent a long time talking to Mead Cadeau, who I tried to invite to come tonight, but he had some other plans. And Mead and I went back and forth, and I know that this says it was near a small farm, and I'm wondering if the small farm does its own butchering. So I don't know if Heather, if you're still on the call. Yeah, do they do their own butchering?
I suspect that they do.
Okay, because what we thought is that maybe these pieces, they butchered their pigs and they had sort of a dump pile, as farmers do, or they put them out, and then some animal took them and took them up. And we came up with a couple of different suspects, both Mead and I. And 2 of them are mammals and 2 of them are birds. So Eric, I'd love to hear your thought on our bird thoughts, but first I'll tell you about the mammals. We thought that either a fisher or a raccoon would have brought up some pieces to sort of scavenge off the leftover bits, sort of cleaning it up. And it would have to have been something relatively small, not like a bobcat, which wouldn't be interested in eating something that was dead already. You know, and that's very catty, is to put something up in a tree, but they usually put a whole carcass up in a tree. To have just the bits of skin, that's sort of scavengery and kind of opportunistic. And that's why we came across fisher and raccoon. And then we got thinking, well, maybe it was a raven or crow. And so, Eric, what do you think about that concept?
I prefer your answer. That's an awfully big piece of carcass for a raven to be, even though ravens are absolutely, they're scavengers, and they will absolutely, I mean, if there was a meat pile or a dump, I would absolutely expect to see ravens and bald eagles and turkey vultures. But that's a big piece of
Yeah.
tissue.
Heather, how does that jive? What do you think about our answers?
Yeah, we were thinking that it had come from some kind of a scavenger pile. And we were wondering maybe if it was a bird, but I like your idea of a fisher cat, because Rebecca's on this call too, and she's my neighbor and she's seen it with me, and she's also seen some fisher cats. So
perfect.
Someone texted.
That might make sense.
Someone texted vulture. It's not a vulture, because a vulture would not, vultures don't have talons that can grasp. And so a vulture would not take a piece, would not be able to, and would not take a piece of carcass and fly away with it. It would consume it on the site. And if it was disturbed, it would fly away without anything, and then wait till if it was a person, wait till the person had gone and they come back. Eagle is the same. A raven would take something and fly away, but that's a big piece for a raven.
Yeah. Well, we like this question. It's very cool. We spend a lot of time kind of batting it around, Mead and I, and I've spent some time thinking about it. Thank you for sharing it. And you'll have to let us know if you find any more bits of creatures hung up in trees.
Thank you, Susie.
You're welcome, Heather. All right, let's see our next one. Where I think, oh yeah, this is the final slide, and this is like you guys are on. This is so cool. This is a pure white porcupine we found camping one night. We were wondering if it's albino or if porcupines get white as they age, like gray hair on people. It was very slow, but it's my understanding they're just kind of a slow creature, so that wouldn't necessarily be a sign of age. So this is indeed an albino porcupine. Porcupines do not kind of go gray the way that we do. And so seeing a porcupine that is completely white like that is a sign of albinoism. And being an albino in a porcupine is extremely rare. It's one, and this is, a little bit, I had to do a little bit of research, but the number I came up with is it's 1 in 10,000 porcupines are born albino. And that is a genetic disorder or a genetic kind of tweak that happens when the melanin is absent from the gene. And so instead of having color, they're white. And one thing that I wondered, and I don't know if anybody from the Zimmer family is here, is if they notice the eyes of the porcupine. Pure albinos will have red eyes. I was really lucky to have found an albino porcupine in Hancock about 3 years ago. It was a little one, and it had red eyes, completely white and red eyes. Pretty amazing, and 1 in 10,000. And one thing that's really hard for albino porcupine is the same thing that gives them the color. The melanin also gives them the stiffness to their quills. So when they're albino, their quills are not stiff. They're softer, and they'll often get predated on faster than other things. But because they look like a porcupine and they're white, they're bright white, and in the darkness, white is a warning color. Think about a skunk, all black, and then that white streak. And even think about a porcupine, not an albino one. They're brown, but when they raise up their quills, the quills are white. That's a warning to predators and other animals, like, be careful, I could be dangerous. So perhaps the albino porcupine, predators don't recognize that it has softer quills, but scientists do. So I think that's really fascinating. Are there any questions about this albino porcupine, or anything that Jeremy or Eric or Miles or Brett might want to add about albino porcupines or albinoism?
I loved your comment, but I did not know that the melanin, the absence of melanin made the quill softer, but that jives with what I know about bird feathers, and that's why so many bird wings, like seagulls, have black tips, because the melanin, it's like if you think of your shoulder patch on, or your elbow patch on your jacket has an extra patch to protect it against wear. Birds have dark wingtips very often because the melanin protects them against wear. It was just cool to hear that about.
Wow, that is really cool. I love that.
That's really cool. Another thing it brings to mind is your 1 in 10,000. We get a call about an albino porcupine about every year at the Harris Center. So there's about 10,000 porcupines in our little region here.
It does make you wonder. Yeah, that could be. I know that I caught that albino porcupine. It was one that was in my orchard, and I let it go a little bit far away, and then people started to call the Harris Center from that area saying, there's a white albino porcupine. I was like, oh, that's my porcupine. So very interesting. All right, I think, is that it, Miles? Is that our last slide? Great. All right, I want to thank everybody for another great evening of Ask a Naturalist, and hoping that you'll join us not next Thursday, but the Thursday after, and send in your questions. And remember, if you take a picture of Scat, put something in for sign about the size, or include the inches. That's really helpful. And yeah, let's make sure we have some good questions about insects, any more plants, animals, anything you come across. We just love it. And in the meantime, get outside and enjoy the spring and coming summer. So thank you all very much for a great evening.
Thank you, Susan.
Thank you.